December 1944. The forests of the Ardennes are buried under a heavy white silence. Only the sound of tank engines and boots crunching through snow breaks the calm. To the American soldiers holding the line, this part of Belgium had been quiet for weeks. Too quiet. Most believed the war was nearly over. Christmas was just days away, and rumors spread that they might be home by spring. But deep inside Germany, another plan was already in motion, one that would shatter that illusion in a single morning. In the early hours of December 16, 1944, that silence exploded into thunder. The German army, thought to be exhausted and broken, launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes. It was Adolf Hitler's last gamble, a desperate bid to split the Allied front, seize the port of Antwerp, and force a peace on his terms. More than 200,000 German troops surged westward through fog and snow, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns. And among those armored columns rolled something new, something unlike anything the Allies had ever faced before. A machine so massive, so fearsome, that even its own crews called it a monster. They called it the Königstiger, the King Tiger, a 70-ton fortress of armor and firepower, the largest operational tank of the Second World War. It carried an 88-millimeter gun, capable of destroying a Sherman tank from over 2 miles away. Its armor was thicker than anything on the battlefield, sloped and welded like a steel bunker. Even a direct hit from most Allied guns would simply bounce off, but it came at a price. Each King Tiger was an engineering marvel, but also an engineering nightmare. Complex, temperamental, and painfully slow to produce. Fewer than 500 would ever be built. Still, in the winter of 1944, Hitler hoped they could turn the tide. As the German spearheads advanced through Belgium, units from Schwerpanzerabteilung 506, the 506th Heavy Tank Battalion, were ordered forward. Their mission: to punch through the American lines near Stavelot and La Glaise, clearing the way for the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte. Adolf Hitler. At the head of the column rolled the King Tiger, tank number 213, commanded by Obersturmführer Rudolf Rudi Gerhardt. It was one of only a handful of these steel giants to take part in the Ardennes offensive. For the men on the ground, it was both a weapon and a symbol. Propaganda hailed it as proof that German engineering could still dominate the battlefield. And for a moment, as those enormous tanks rumbled through the forests of the Ardennes, it seemed true. On the American side, chaos reigned. Forward positions were overwhelmed. Communications collapsed. Entire regiments were caught in the open, unsure of what they were facing. Reports came in of super tanks, machines that shrugged off artillery shells and destroyed Sherman after Sherman in a single shot. Many American gunners refused to believe the rumors until they saw one themselves. The First Army's 3rd Armored Division, known as Spearhead, soon encountered these new Tigers near La Glaise. Their 76-millimeter guns could do little more than scratch the paint. It was a terrifying discovery. The enemy had built something that could outshoot and outlast nearly every Allied tank in Europe, but the King Tiger had an enemy of its own: mechanical failure. Its engine, a 700-horsepower Maybach, was powerful but overworked. Its gearbox strained under the tank's massive weight. In freezing temperatures and muddy roads, breakdowns became inevitable. Of the dozens of King Tigers sent into the Ardennes, many never reached combat. Some ran out of fuel, others broke axles or overheated transmissions. For all its armor and firepower, the King Tiger could be stopped by something far less dramatic than enemy fire: a mechanical cough, a broken tread, a few gallons of missing fuel. By December 24th, the German advance had stalled. The Americans were regrouping, counterattacking, and the mighty Tiger II, once the spearhead of the offensive, began to litter the frozen roads of Belgium, abandoned, burning, or simply stuck in snowdrifts. One such vehicle, tank number 213, was left behind near the village of La Glaise. Its crew, low on fuel and cut off from reinforcements, destroyed the engine and escaped on foot. When American troops entered the area days later, they found it exactly where it had stopped, a hulking monument to Germany's last gamble. To the soldiers who approached it, the sight was surreal. The King Tiger towered over them, taller than a man even at the tracks, its 88mm gun still aimed toward the west. Its armor, almost 2 inches thick, bore the scars of ricocheting shells that had failed to penetrate. They'd heard about it for months. Now, standing before it, they realized what the stories meant. Engineers from the U.S. 3rd Armored Division and ordnance teams moved in to examine it. They quickly realized this was no ordinary tank. Everything about it, its layout, its suspension, its precision machining, spoke of an engineering philosophy decades ahead of its time. Even in defeat, the King Tiger inspired awe. One American officer reportedly said, "It's not that they built a bad tank. They just built it for the wrong war." That abandoned hulk, half buried in snow, would soon become a prize of enormous value. For U.S. intelligence and ordnance experts, it was an opportunity to study the enemy's most advanced weapon up close. Within weeks, a team was dispatched to recover the tank. What they would discover inside, and what it would teach them, would change the course of post-war tank design. But before that could happen, the Americans had to do something no one had attempted before: haul a 70-ton monster out of a frozen battlefield, through destroyed villages, and across the Atlantic Ocean. That would be the beginning of the King Tiger's second life. Not as a weapon of war, but as a symbol of technological rivalry between the victors and the vanquished. The tank sat silent in the snow, its steel hull steaming faintly in the frigid air. American patrols from the 3rd Armored Division were the first to reach it. They approached cautiously, rifles ready, expecting it might still be manned. But as they circled the wreck, they found the hatches blown open, the crew gone, and the massive machine lifeless. The King Tiger, once the pride of Hitler's armored forces, had been left behind like a stranded beast. The road that led to La Glaise was littered with frozen wrecks, Panthers, half-tracks, supply trucks, all abandoned during the German retreat. Yet nothing compared to this. Standing next to it, the Americans felt as if they were beside something almost otherworldly. Its sheer size, the craftsmanship of its armor plates, even the smell of burned oil, it was unlike anything they had ever encountered. Engineers and ordnance officers soon arrived to inspect it. They measured, photographed, and sketched everything. The German markings were still visible beneath soot and ice. Some of the men even climbed inside, marveling at the complexity of the controls, the heavy hydraulic levers, and the gun breech large enough for a man to crawl through. "They built this thing like a battleship," one sergeant said, shaking his head. Word spread quickly through the division. Soldiers came from nearby positions just to see the captured tank with their own eyes. They touched its armor, posed for photographs, and stared in disbelief. To them, this machine was both terrifying and magnificent. It was a glimpse into what the enemy had been capable of, even in the final, desperate months of the war. By late December, snowstorms rolled through the region again. The tank remained frozen in place as American command debated what to do with it. Some suggested blowing it up to prevent the Germans from reclaiming it. But higher up the chain, a different decision was made. Intelligence officers realized that such a machine, intact and mostly undamaged, could provide invaluable information about German design and metallurgy. They ordered that it be salvaged, studied, and, if possible, sent back to the United States. The order went to the 129th Ordnance Maintenance Battalion, specialists in heavy recovery. Moving a 70-ton tank through destroyed villages and narrow Belgian roads was a challenge no one had ever faced before. The recovery crew arrived with massive Diamond T tractors, winches, and cables, their breath visible in the cold morning air. For hours, they cleared rubble, reinforced bridges, and laid temporary planking across the frozen ground. When they finally managed to attach the cables, the first attempt to move the King Tiger failed. The tank barely budged, its tracks were half frozen into the earth, and its suspension locked solid. The Americans had to dig around the wheels and heat the metal with torches just to loosen it. Slowly, inch by inch, the enormous vehicle began to roll again, its treads leaving deep scars in the snow. Local villagers emerged from their homes to watch the strange sight: a captured German supertank being dragged through their streets by American trucks. To them it was a symbol of liberation, a trophy of victory. Some of the soldiers painted chalk words on the side: "Captured by Spearhead." It became both a practical task and a morale booster. By early January 1945, the tank reached a rail yard outside Liège. There, crews loaded it onto a flat car using cranes and wooden ramps reinforced with steel beams. The logistics were staggering. Every move had to be planned in detail. Bridges had weight limits, rail curves had to be tested, and the tank's gun had to be fixed in place to prevent shifting during transport. From Liège, the King Tiger was transported to Antwerp, still bearing battle scars and traces of snow on its hull. American MPs guarded the train as it moved slowly through war-torn countryside. Civilians gathered at stations to stare at the monstrous shape under canvas tarps, whispering rumors about it, some calling it Hitler's secret weapon, others believing it could stop any Allied tank in existence. At the port, U.S. engineers faced their next problem: how to load a 70-ton tank onto a ship. The harbor cranes strained under the weight, and for a time it seemed impossible. Finally, a combination of floating cranes and reinforced slings managed the job. The tank was secured in the hold of a cargo vessel bound for England, and from there, across the Atlantic. The journey took weeks. Salt air corroded its paint, and the steel hull collected condensation, but it survived the crossing intact. When the ship docked at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, the King Tiger had traveled farther than any of its kind, 800 miles from the snowy forests of Belgium to the industrial docks of America. When it arrived, teams of ordnance specialists and engineers were waiting. They had studied captured German weapons before: Panthers, Panzerwerfers, and even V-2 rockets, but this was different. This was the pinnacle of German armored design. They moved it carefully onto a concrete testing platform, removing panels and components with surgical precision. Inside the turret, they found meticulous craftsmanship: precisely machined gears, robust recoil systems, and advanced optics. The crew compartment was cramped but efficient, designed for trained specialists. Every bolt, every weld told a story of Germany's late-war obsession with perfection, even as the nation crumbled around it. The American engineers took notes on everything: armor thickness, welding methods, track design, and engine performance. They compared it with their own tanks, the M4 Sherman and the newer M26 Pershing. The differences were astonishing. Where American tanks emphasized simplicity and speed of production, the King Tiger was a masterpiece of over-engineering. It was clear to the analysts that this tank was built not for mass warfare, but for industrial pride. It embodied the German belief that superior craftsmanship could overcome overwhelming numbers, and in many ways, it almost did. Photographs of the captured tank soon appeared in Allied technical bulletins and intelligence reports. Soldiers who had fought in Europe were stunned to see the giant machine now resting safely on American soil. Some visited it in person, standing beneath its towering barrel, remembering how it had once been the enemy's most feared weapon. For the engineers at Aberdeen, it became more than just a curiosity. It was a lesson, a reminder that innovation and excess often go hand in hand. The King Tiger's armor and gun were unmatched, but its mechanical fragility had doomed it long before it could make a difference. As tests continued through the spring of 1945, the war in Europe came to an end. Germany surrendered, and with it, the age of the Tiger tank. But in that quiet moment, as American technicians studied its steel bones, they could sense the beginning of a new era, one where tank design would evolve faster, grow deadlier, and move toward a future shaped by what they learned from this captured monster. The King Tiger, once a symbol of German dominance, had now become a teacher, and the lessons it offered would echo through every tank built in the decades that followed. At Aberdeen, the work began quietly. The King Tiger sat under a makeshift shelter while teams of engineers and ordnance officers from the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, along with civilian specialists, gathered around it like surgeons around a patient. For weeks, they documented every inch of the machine. They removed the engine block, dismantled the suspension, and studied the massive 88mm KWK-43 gun that had terrorized Allied tank crews in Europe. The first impression among the engineers was a mix of admiration and disbelief. The Germans had built something extraordinary, but they had also built something deeply impractical. Each component was crafted with incredible precision, often machined to tolerances far beyond what was necessary. The tank was not just engineered, it was over-engineered, built like a precision instrument rather than a battlefield weapon. As they examined the Maybach HL-230 engine, the Americans noticed that it was forced to operate at the edge of its capabilities. In a tank that weighed over 70 tons, the same engine that powered the smaller Panther had been pushed beyond its limits. It produced tremendous power but at the cost of reliability. Gearboxes cracked, final drives overheated, and the fuel consumption was staggering. One test report later noted that the King Tiger could barely travel 40 miles on a full tank under combat conditions. Inside the crew compartment, they discovered something else: efficiency in chaos. Every lever, switch, and periscope had its place, designed for trained specialists who could operate under pressure. The interior was cramped but well thought out. Even the welds and rivets spoke of meticulous craftsmanship. German design philosophy favored precision above all else, while American design emphasized function and production speed. The difference could not have been more obvious. By February 1945, the Ordnance Department had begun live fire testing. Using range facilities at Aberdeen, they fired American anti-tank guns, high-explosive rounds, and even captured German weapons at the King Tiger's armor. The results were startling. The front glacis plate, 150 millimeters thick and sloped at 50 degrees, proved nearly impenetrable. Even the 90mm gun from the new M26 Pershing barely made a dent at long range. The engineers were forced to admit a hard truth. If the Germans had been able to build these tanks in large numbers and field them with proper logistics, the Allied push into Europe might have been far more costly. But they also saw the flaws that made that impossible. The tank's weight destroyed bridges. Its complexity required skilled maintenance crews, and its fuel demands were unsustainable for a nation already starving for resources. As the tests continued, ordnance officers compared the results with field reports from the front. Many American units had already encountered the King Tiger in battle, especially during the fighting in Belgium and eastern Germany. These reports confirmed what the engineers now understood firsthand. The King Tiger was both brilliant and doomed. It dominated on open ground but broke down in the field. It could kill anything it faced, but it could not move fast enough to control a battlefield that was now ruled by air power and mobility. During one demonstration, the Americans decided to test the Tiger's 88mm cannon. They reassembled the turret and fired several rounds downrange. The results were breathtaking. The shell punched through 3 inches of steel plating from over a mile away, leaving a hole as clean as if drilled by machinery. The observers, some of whom had fought in Europe, stood in silent respect. It was a weapon of terrifying precision. Yet, as one officer noted, it doesn't matter how strong the sword is if the arm that wields it is already broken. By mid-1945, with Germany's surrender now official, the captured Tiger had become part of a larger study. The Americans, joined by British and Soviet observers, were gathering every piece of German technology they could find: rockets, jet aircraft, radar, and armor. Operation Paperclip was already underway, bringing scientists and engineers to the United States to study what the Reich had built. The King Tiger became another artifact of that technological autopsy, a relic of a war that had pushed human ingenuity to its limits. For months, it remained at Aberdeen as analysts drafted reports comparing it to Allied designs. They concluded that while the Tiger II's firepower and protection were unmatched, its design philosophy had failed to adapt to modern warfare. The world had moved beyond heavy fortresses and toward speed, efficiency, and adaptability. The tank that was meant to save Germany instead showed the limits of its industrial ambition. Still, the American teams could not help but be impressed. Many of the design lessons from the Tiger would quietly influence post-war American tank development. The M26 Pershing and later the M46 Patton, adopted thicker frontal armor and more powerful guns, inspired in part by what engineers learned from their German counterpart. Even decades later, the echoes of the King Tiger's design could be seen in Cold War armor, its emphasis on sloped armor and long-range firepower becoming standards in tank warfare. But back in 1945, the King Tiger was more than a study subject. It was a symbol of victory over an enemy that had once seemed invincible. Soldiers visiting Aberdeen would stop to stare at it, some out of curiosity, others out of respect. Many remembered hearing about the super tank that could destroy a Sherman in one shot. Now here it was, silent and powerless, its gun pointed harmlessly at the Maryland sky. Engineers eventually reassembled the turret and tracks for public demonstration. When they tried to start the engine, it roared briefly to life before choking on its own smoke. The massive machine trembled, shuddered, and went still again. It was a fitting metaphor, the last breath of a dying empire's greatest weapon. As 1945 drew to a close, reports from Aberdeen circulated through military channels. One conclusion stood out. The Tiger II represents the apex of German armored development and the inevitable collapse of a design philosophy that valued perfection over practicality. The King Tiger had shown the Allies what German engineering could achieve, and what it had cost them. It was a weapon that had arrived too late, built too expensively, and operated in a war that no longer suited it. By winter, the tank was moved to an outdoor display area. It sat there through the years that followed, rusting slowly under rain and snow. Visitors came to see it, children climbed on it, and veterans stood silently beside it, remembering what it had once meant. To them, it was more than steel and bolts. It was history, frozen at the exact moment when the balance of power in Europe shifted forever. In the end, the King Tiger taught both sides a lesson that would define the modern age. Power alone was not enough. Machines could win battles, but only nations that understood efficiency and adaptability could win wars. The years after the war turned the King Tiger from a weapon into a curiosity. By 1946, it stood quietly at Aberdeen Proving Ground, its paint faded, and its once feared silhouette gathering dust beside other captured machines of the Third Reich. Around it were the trophies of a vanished army, Panthers, Stu-Gs, even a handful of experimental vehicles that had never reached the front. But none drew as much attention as the Tiger II. Military officers, engineers, and visiting foreign delegations came to see it. They ran their hands over its thick armor, stared into the cavernous muzzle of its 88mm gun, and wondered how such an extraordinary creation could have been defeated. For the Americans, it was an engineering marvel, but also a warning. It represented a nation that had poured its soul into machinery at the expense of everything else. In the months that followed, analysts compiled the final technical report. Page after page of measurements, photographs, and ballistic test data were assembled into binders labeled simply German Tank, Panzerkampfwagen, Tiger Ausf. B. The conclusions were clear and unsparing. The Tiger II's design embodied the pinnacle of craftsmanship, but it ignored the realities of war. It demanded too much maintenance, too much fuel, and too much time. The tank's greatest strength, its invulnerability, had also been its undoing. Still, the lessons it offered proved invaluable. The post-war generation of American engineers studied its suspension layout, its gun stabilization system, and its welded armor structure. They found ideas that would later echo through future tank designs: the angled armor that deflected incoming rounds, the heavy mantlet that shielded the main gun, and the internal compartment organization that maximized efficiency for a small crew. The Tiger II, in its defeat, had become a teacher. But beyond the blueprints and measurements, the tank held a deeper fascination. Veterans who had faced German armor in the fields of France or the Ardennes would stop and stare at it in silence. Some walked around it slowly, tracing their fingers over the scars left by ricochets and shell impacts. For them, this was not just a machine. It was a reminder of comrades lost, of nights spent under shell fire, of battles where the enemy seemed unstoppable. Others saw it differently. To younger officers, the Tiger II represented the kind of technological obsession that had nearly doomed the world. They admired its brilliance, but recognized the flaw in its conception. In the new atomic age, wars would not be won by superweapons alone, but by strategy, logistics, and speed. The Tiger, for all its might, had belonged to another era. By 1947, Aberdeen's engineers began repurposing the lessons learned from their studies. They applied them to the M46 and M47 Patton tanks, which were entering design stages for a new kind of warfare, faster, more mobile, and supported by air power. Gone were the days of massive steel fortresses creeping across the battlefield. Now tanks had to keep pace with jets, helicopters, and atomic artillery. The King Tiger had been designed for the last war, not the next. Still, there was a strange reverence for it. Journalists visiting the proving ground often described it as a monument to both genius and futility. Some even referred to it as a relic of an age when machines were built by hand, when every bolt and weld bore the mark of its maker. In an era rapidly turning toward mass production and standardized design, the King Tiger seemed almost alive, an artifact of craftsmanship that the modern world was already forgetting. Occasionally, military demonstrations would feature it as a static exhibit. Children posed for photographs beside its enormous treads, and veterans pointed to the insignia still faintly visible under chipped paint. For the public, it was a curiosity. For the military, it remained a quiet classroom. The Ordnance Department used it to train new engineers in armor design, metallurgy, and ballistics. They would examine the tank's armor under microscopes, studying the crystalline structure of its steel, learning how German factories had managed to achieve such uniformity despite Allied bombing. In time, the Tiger II became something else entirely, a cultural symbol. Stories about the invincible German tank spread through newspapers and magazines. Popular accounts exaggerated its capabilities, describing it as indestructible, unstoppable, even mythical. Hollywood would later borrow its image for films that dramatized the European war. Yet those who had studied it knew the truth. It had never lived up to its legend. During one inspection in the early 1950s, an aging ordnance officer who had been part of the recovery operation in Belgium visited Aberdeen again. He stood beside the King Tiger, now weathered and rust-streaked, and remembered the cold of the Ardennes, the snow crunching under his boots as he first saw it lying half-buried on a Belgian road. "It was terrifying then," he said quietly, "and now it's just steel." By the end of that decade, the tank's operational systems had deteriorated beyond repair. The engine no longer turned, and rust had claimed the tracks, yet no one dared to scrap it. The Tiger II remained where it stood, an immovable monument to the war that had shaped the century. As the Cold War deepened, military thinkers continued to study its lessons. The United States and the Soviet Union were both developing new classes of main battle tanks, and echoes of the Tiger's design could be seen in both nations' work. Sloped armor, heavier guns, improved optics, all were ideas refined from studying machines like the one that now rested silently in Maryland. For historians, the tank represented a turning point, a moment when technology had nearly outpaced practicality. It proved that there was a limit to how far one could push design without understanding the cost of complexity. The Tiger II was the perfect metaphor for Nazi Germany itself, powerful, ambitious, but doomed by its own excess. In the years that followed, Aberdeen's collection grew smaller as older vehicles were moved to museums or scrapped. But the King Tiger remained. It stood through rain, snow, and sun, its armor streaked with rust but still intact, as if refusing to die. For visitors, it became a bridge to the past, a tangible reminder of a war that had redefined humanity's relationship with machines. And for those who remembered the day it was first found, broken down on a frozen Belgian road, it was proof of a simple truth. Even the strongest machines fail. The proudest empires crumble, and time buries all giants, no matter how powerful they once seemed. Decades passed, and the King Tiger's story faded into the background of history. The world moved on, new wars, new machines, new frontiers. But for a handful of historians, soldiers, and engineers, the tank remained an object of fascination. It was more than an artifact. It was a conversation between generations of warfare. In the 1960s, curators began restoring several surviving Tiger IIs in Europe. The most famous was the one left in La Glaise, Belgium. Its massive hull still scarred from battle, its turret frozen in place. Local villagers had refused to let it be scrapped after the war. For them, it wasn't just a German tank, it was a symbol of what they had endured during the Battle of the Bulge, when their town became a fortress for retreating SS troops. Children played around it. Tourists posed beside it. Over the years it rusted and faded, but it never disappeared. Meanwhile, in the United States, Aberdeen's King Tiger remained a silent sentinel. Soldiers stationed nearby often visited it on weekends. Some said standing next to it felt like meeting a ghost from another world. Mechanics marveled at its welds and craftsmanship, while tank crews wondered how it had ever been defeated. The truth was simple. It had defeated itself long before it met an American shell. As Cold War tanks rolled out of factories, Pattons, Centurions, and T-55s, designers still found themselves referring to lessons drawn from the German war machines. Reports from Aberdeen's post-war studies circulated through engineering schools and military institutions. The Tiger II became a textbook example of what happens when power overshadows practicality. It had more armor and firepower than any Allied tank, but it couldn't keep up with the war it was built for. By the 1970s, military documentaries began to feature the Tiger's story. Grainy black and white footage showed American soldiers walking around its massive hull, examining its shattered engine deck. The narrator's voice always carried the same tone, a mix of awe and disbelief. "The King Tiger," they would say, "was the mightiest tank of the Second World War. Yet in the end, it was beaten not by its enemies, but by its own design." In Europe, collectors and restorers began hunting for surviving examples. Pieces of wrecked Tigers were pulled from rivers, barns, and forests. One hull was recovered from a Polish swamp, another from a farm near Vienna. Restorers painstakingly reassembled them from fragments, each bolt and bearing treated like a relic from an ancient civilization. And in a way, that's exactly what they were. By the 1990s, the Tiger du Sceau had transcended its original purpose. It had become a legend, part history, part myth. Books and documentaries romanticized it as the ultimate war machine, a symbol of mechanical supremacy. Video games and model kits carried its image to new generations who had never seen war. But the truth behind the myth was still the same. The King Tiger had failed because it tried to be perfect in a world that demanded adaptability. The surviving tanks, just a handful scattered across Europe and America, became silent storytellers. The one at Bovington Tank Museum in England was restored to running condition for a time, its engine thundering to life for demonstrations. Crowds gathered to witness it move, astonished by its size and sound. Every rumble of its Maybach engine seemed to echo from another century, reminding onlookers of the monstrous ambitions that had created it. At Aberdeen, however, the American King Tiger eventually succumbed to the elements. By the early 2000s, its paint had peeled, and corrosion had crept deep into the steel. When the Ordnance Museum relocated its collection to Fort Lee, the Tiger II was carefully transported once more, just as it had been half a century earlier, when American crews first towed it from a Belgian field. This time, though, it wasn't a captured enemy. It was a piece of history being preserved. Today, the King Tiger stands as one of the last surviving witnesses of a vanished era. Its massive gun points skyward, its armor still bearing the marks of battle. Around it, museum visitors walk slowly, whispering as they imagine what it must have been like to face such a machine in combat. Some see it as a symbol of German engineering brilliance. Others see it as a warning about the dangers of excess and obsession. Either way, the King Tiger's legacy endures. It represents both the height and the limits of human ingenuity in wartime. It teaches that even the most powerful machines are bound by the same law that governs empires and armies alike. Complexity without balance leads to collapse. And so in the quiet halls of museums and the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the story comes full circle. The tank that once symbolized unstoppable force now stands motionless, conquered not by guns or bombs, but by time. For the American crews who captured it, the King Tiger was a revelation. For historians, it remains a paradox, a masterpiece that never fulfilled its promise. And for the rest of us, it's a reminder that even the strongest steel can break, and that the mightiest weapons of war often become, in the end, monuments to their own defeat.